We now move to the next session. That is, we are moving to a different genre now. This is storytelling in epics and the classical literature. We have three papers in this. So I invite Swetha ji Prakash, who will speak about storytelling in Yoga Vasistha, a study, an interesting subject. Swetha ji has authored a book on Indian storytelling traditions. She's also won a grant from the Indic Academy to record Indic stories on YouTube. I'm one of those who regularly watches it. The work from this grant can be, that's a YouTube link that you can check it out. She's author of 12 other books. These include Indic books, children's books, storytelling collections, poetry collection, and so on. She's been the recipient of the Times and Scottish Book Trust Jura New Writer Award and Charles Wallace India Trust Award. Over to Swetha ji.
So this is a photograph of Karkati the Rakshasi. She has the face of a crab and hence the name Karkati. Is a dreadful Rakshasi and she loves devouring people. But she would not devour anyone who has enlightening knowledge because she is a seeker of enlightenment herself. And this, from her story, what we learn is that if you have enlightening knowledge, even a Rakshasi would not devour you and the Rakshasi would try to learn from you. This is a story of enlightenment. It's a story known as the Mahara Mayana. It is from the Ramayana of Vashishta, Rama's guru. Rama, the prince of Ayodhya, asked questions of his preceptor Vasistha. What is the point of this useless existence? And the answers are recorded in this book, the Mahara Mayana. This is an incredible book because the questionnaire is Rama, the supreme Brahman himself. And the person who answers the questions is Vashishta. And the means of communicating nirvana is through stories. It is among the foremost of texts which explains the path to nirvana, moksha, salvation, while still being involved in samsara. The context to the Yoga Vashishta is that Rama is 16 years old. He has just gone on a pilgrimage and he finds that he's no longer interested in life once he returns to Ayodhya. He's just seated in one posture. He's not interested in doing anything. He has just lost interest in everything. He feels the life he has seen around him is utterly and completely pointless and useless. And at that time, there enters the sage Vishwamitra. The sage Vishwamitra wants to request for Rama's company to kill the Rakshasas who are disrupting the yajna. But when they go to meet Rama, they discover that Rama is in a perplexed state of mind. He's disinterested in worldly affairs and hardly interested in killing Rakshasas or doing anything actually. So at that time, Vishwamitra suggests to Rama that he talk to Vashishta, the Kulguru of the Ikshvaku clan. And this story is the story of the stories that Vashishta tells Rama so that he can attain nirvana. But the story of Yoga Vashishta doesn't start here. Where does Yoga Vashishta start? It starts with the story of Sutikshana. Why does it start with the story of Sutikshana? Surely the story is very, very important for us to understand what the Yoga Vashishta is all about. Sutikshana is a very learned person. He requires, he knows everything. He knows the Vedas, he knows the Vedantas, he knows the Shastras, he knows the Dharma Shastras, the epics, the Puranas, everything he has knowledge. But still he's not confused. He says, should I pursue knowledge or should I perform my daily karmas? And for this, to the answer to this question, he goes to meet the sage Agasti. The sage Agasti tells him, have you seen a bird? How does a bird fly? It flies with two wings. Similarly, you too must use both karma, which is action, and knowledge to attain the final truth, liberation. So in this story, we find that there are three things. One is that there is the path of knowledge, which is essential, the path of karma or action, which is also essential. But the goal of both these paths is liberation. And when we start with this, we know that the purpose of Yoga Vashishta is to get Rama, who's disinterested in action, to become interested in action through knowledge, Jnana Yoga, and also help him attain moksha so that he lives a fulfilled life of a sage. The first story in Yoga Vashishta is the story of Sukha. The next story in Yoga Vashishta is the story of Sukha. This is an illustration of a seeker who is similar to Sri Ram. In this world, there exists nothing except one universal self. Sukha knows this, but he is not able to understand this truth. I mean, he knows all the theories because Sukha's father is Vedavyasa. So he's already well acquainted with the Shastras. He knows the Puranas. His father has written the Mahabharata. His father only compiled the Vedas. But the problem is that how does he experience this knowledge? So his father tries to teach him, but he's not listening. So his father sends him to meet the sage Janaka. Janaka is not just a sage, but a king. So he is somebody who practices both knowledge, karma yoga, as well as jnana yoga, being an enlightened king. So Janaka asks Sukha to wait outside the gate. He doesn't even allow Sukha into the gate. But Sukha is unperturbed. He has no interest, even though Janaka doesn't allow him inside. After 10 days, Janaka allows him to meet him at the kingdom of Videha. There, Janaka again refuses to meet him, but surrounds Sukha with all kinds of sensory pleasures. Sukha, knowing that these pleasures are transient, is again disinterested. Finally, Janaka allows Sukha to come in, and he tells Sukha, Sukha, you already know that which needs to be done. In this world, there are things that we are revulsed by, like you would have been revulsed by standing at my gate and my refusing to see you, or things we are attracted to, like you entering my gate and finding all the pleasurable things of the world in there. Now, Sukha, since you are already aware of raga and dvesha and are indifferent to both of them, I would suggest that you just stay established yourself like I myself am. And since you already know the supreme truth, you just have to ensure that you are not creating more desires for yourself or more aversions for yourself. But it is a fact you are already enlightened. Now, this example of Sukha is given to Rama to explain that there is a seeker who is like him, who is already enlightened, and that seeker was indeed Sukha. Then we move to the story of Vashishta. Vashishta is the mind-born son of Brahma. Brahma creates Vashishta because the world is full of misery and human beings are in a state of suffering. Now, Vashishta, when he's born, he is filled with realization. He's filled with bliss. He is a self-realized sage from the time of birth itself. But because Brahma wants Vashishta to teach the art of self-realization to the world, he dilutes Vashishta, and Vashishta is filled with Maya and he becomes sad. He experiences emotions like grief and sorrow and suffering, and he understands the life of other human beings. Soon he tries to find a way out of this, and he goes into meditation. And then he comes up with the answers about why he was miserable and how he can overcome that misery. Brahma blesses him and tells him that he will be able to tell his story to the entire world through the form of Yoga Vashishta. Now, Yoga Vashishta, the goal of Yoga Vashishta is different from all the different types of stories that we have read in other contexts. The goal of the stories in Yoga Vashishta, there are many stories in Yoga Vashishta, and the reason these stories are a conversation between Sri Ram and Vashishta is that Sri Ram needs to, Vashishta feels that if Rama listens to these stories, he will attain enlightenment. Now, the goal of each of the stories is a philosophical realization or a direct realization of the truth. And they are also dealing with the nature of the cosmic self, the individual self, and the purpose of existence, so that Rama is able to act in this world. These stories have a moral, but the moral of these stories is not the same as the morals we find in other stories. So if you pick up a Jataka, you will find a story which will say greed is terrible or wastefulness is a bad characteristic. But the moral of the stories in Yoga Vashishta is very different and distinct. So I'll just go through some of the morals of the stories in the different stories in Yoga Vashishta. The first is the story of Leela. This is a story of a queen who is a devotee of the goddess Saraswati and who is married to a king called Padma who is engaged in warfare. Now, Leela in her past life was Arundhati and her husband was in fact Vashishta. And Vashishta sees a king go by. So because he sees the king, he decides that he himself wants to be a king and he turns into a king from being a sage. So this story examines the questions of how wishes can create the existence. So what we are is a result or a consequence of what we wish for. Then the story of Karkati the Rakshasi. Karkati is a dreadful Rakshasi. She wants to devour everybody. But for the purpose of devouring people, she performs a lot of tapasya. And as a consequence of all this tapasya that she does, she starts getting attracted towards the knowledge of enlightenment. And whenever she would see people, she would first ask them questions before she would devour them. And if they were enlightened and if they were able to answer her questions, she would not devour them. So what she learns in the course of her journey is that even as a tree exists in a seed, the entire universe exists in the self, which is of the nature of pure consciousness. And this is what she learns as she questions people and quizzes them. Then the story of the sons of Indu. Indu was a learned person and he passes away. He has 10 sons. Because the children are first in grief, they are paralyzed with fear. But soon, because they have to do something in this existence, they sit in a place and they meditate. And they start creating universes by themselves through the power of their meditation. And just by sitting in one place, they create entire suns. And these are not children, but suns as in the solar system's suns. And what the story tries to tell us is the mind alone is the creator of the world. Then we have the story of Ahalya. This is not the same story of Ahalya that we find in the Valmiki Ramayana. This Ahalya is the wife of a king called Indradyumna and the lover of a person called Indra. Now, Indra and Ahalya want to want to continue their relationship, whereas Indradyumna wants to torture them. And he tortures them. But because they are indifferent to the torture, they exist. And what the story is trying to tell us is that the individual is the mind alone. And even if the body is tortured, it does not affect the mind and it does not change the person. Then there is the story of the great forest. And in the great forest, there is this person with 1,000 arms. And this person has fallen down and he is continuously beating himself on the head. This person is actually the ego. And the idea behind this story is that the world is a great void, and this void can only be understood in the wisdom of self-inquiry. The story of King Janaka. King Janaka, who had earlier featured in the Sukha story, is, of course, an enlightened sage from the Upanishadic tradition and also from the Ramayana tradition. And he encounters a set of perfected sages and they sing songs to him on the nature of the self. So this is similar to the Ashtavakra Gita, which is also from the King Janaka tradition also. And what they teach him is that freed from all mental conditioning and intention, perform appropriate action in a spontaneous manner. Then there is the story of Punya. So the objective here is to see how these morals of the story are so different from the stories we otherwise see. So in stories, we have stories like in Panchatantra, for example, the morals of stories are beware of a certain kind of character or protect yourself. But here the morals of the stories itself are leading towards a sort of a higher state of being, a meditative consciousness. Then there's the story of Punya and Pavana. Punya and Pavana are brothers and they lose their father. Punya is enlightened, so he's not disturbed by this, but Pavana is extremely disturbed. So Punya helps Pavana see the truth of the universal existence so that his mental sorrow ceases. So this is a very important point in Yoga Vashishta, which is that people are grieving. And if they start meditating on the higher self, the grief can come to an end. And the moral of the story here is craving is what causes mental disturbance. And once the craving is removed, mental peace is attained. Then we have the story of Bali. The mind, Bali is, of course, the same king that we've encountered many times in the story of Trivikrama. But here, he is in a state of enlightenment and he's having a conversation with his father, Viprachitti. Now, the thing is that the difference between the Puranic stories is that Asuras there are not expected to have too much intelligence, or they do not spend time thinking about enlightening subjects. But in Yoga Vashishta, we find Rakshasas, Asuras, vampires, all engaged in the question of the existence. And he concludes that the mind is not subdued without persistent practice. Then the story of Prahlada. The Prahlada is, of course, the same Prahlada who features in the Hiranyakashipu story and the Lord Narasimha story. And he attains liberation by thinking of himself as Vishnu. So this is the story of how Prahlada attains liberation. Now, as the stories progress, it's all about, the first part was about what is the nature of existence. And then we go on to the story of how these different characters in the different stories attain liberation. So Prahlada attains liberation by thinking of Lord Vishnu. Gadi attains liberation by asking Vishnu to show him his Maya. And then in a state of out of body consciousness, he witnesses things that are happening to him as not happening to him. And the story of Udalaka is that he realizes that sense pleasures are like poison plants, while supreme pleasure rests in one's own heart. And similarly, the story of Suragu, who has a conversation with another sage, is that wisdom arises in one who is rooted in self-knowledge. Then there is a story of Bhasha and Vilasa, who are the children of two sages. And they talk about sorrow, and they say sorrow will remain as long as notions of I and mine remain. Then there's a story of Hitahavya. And Hitahavya says that one must rest in consciousness, which is the nature of pure intelligence. And he goes into a deep state of meditation. Then there is the very famous story of Kakbhushundi, who's an immortal crow. And his advice, apart from pranayama advice, is to stay established in the self and renounce attraction and aversion. Then there's the story of the wood apple and the world. The cosmic consciousness is compared to being a wood apple. And the way to access the cosmic, the way for the individual to access the cosmic consciousness is for the individual to know that the mind is a knower of the truth, and it thus becomes a no mind being filled with sattva. Then there is the famous story of Arjuna from the Bhagavad Gita. And the advice given to Arjuna is that the cessation of all mental conditioning, thoughts, notions, and intentions is the realization of the Supreme Self. The story of the 100 Rudras. This is the story of a mendicant who keeps meditating on different people, objects, animals, birds, and keeps turning into them. But finally, when he thinks of Rudra, he turns into Rudra himself. And the moral of the story is you turn into whatever you're thinking about. Then there's the story of a vampire who has a conversation with the king and concludes that all the universes we see around us are but the minutest atomic particles. Then there's a story of a rock, and this rock is the cosmic consciousness in which different carvings exist or don't. And by meditating on this rock, we can understand the nature of this universe. There's a story of Bhagiratha, which is also there in the Ramayana. But in here, Bhagiratha has finished his meditation. He has brought Ganga back to the earth, and he's thinking about how he can attain nirvana. And he realizes that when the ego sense is removed, self-knowledge shines forth. Then there is the story of Shikadwaja and Chudala. Shikadwaja is married to Queen Chudala, who is an enlightened sage, and he himself is not enlightened. So he wants to seek enlightenment, so he goes to the forest. But his wife, who is completely enlightened, comes in a disguise and teaches him the meaning or the essence of salvation and enlightenment. Then there's a story of a deluded man who thinks that the place that he owns the place around him, and he invests all his time and money around the place that he's born into. And this is telling us that we have to get over our ego sense. Then there's the story of Ikshvaku. And there's a conversation between Ikshvaku and Manu, in which Manu tells Ikshvaku that the enlightened person is without darkness, haziness, and delusions. Then there's a story of a world of the world within a rock. There is a woman who has been meditating for years, and inside a rock, she finds entire universes. And the idea being that reflected in the infinite consciousness are images of countless universes. There are thousands of universes that exist around us, and these are all resting in the same infinite consciousness. Then there's a sage from outer space whom Vashishta meets. And this sage says that he has gone to outer space, and he's done a lot of activities which have resulted in siddhis through pranayama itself. So this again brings us back to yoga. So it's not just about nirvana, but it's also about yoga itself. Then there's a story of Vipaschit who has to fight a battle with the enemy. He enters the fire and comes out in 4 forms. Now this story is very interesting because it's telling us that apart from gaining nirvana, the enlightening knowledge can also help us act in the material world, and it will help us in our karmas, not just with jnana. So one is the well-woven nature descriptions. Then there are stories with Rakshasas as protagonists, with Asuras as protagonists, all seeking the enlightened knowledge. Then there is a lot of time travel, alternative reality, parallel universes, something that will resonate with today's readers of science fiction and fantasy. The characters have little concern for their physical states or bodies and often engage in intensive tapasya. An important point made is that all of this creation is basically a result of self-effort and what the mind thinks about. And there is also an allude to causation. So somebody thought of being a deer, so they became a deer. The stories are not just on Advaita, but also on Maya, the world as an optical illusion. So I'll just conclude. The first section of Yoga Vashishta, Sri Ram asks, who are those heroes who have freed themselves from Maya and darkness, and how did they free themselves? The narratives in Yoga Vashishta are a means to nirvana. The context of storytelling is that the supreme person Rama is himself asking the questions. And the reason Yoga Vashishta is so important as a scripture is that it's easy to comprehend because it is embellished with stories. The objective of storytelling in Yoga Vashishta is the direct realization of the truth.
Thank you so much, Swetha ji. I think, all of us know Yoga Vasistha as a philosophical text, but the, extent to which stories form the narration of philosophy is something that is often missed out. It's also very interesting that even something like philosophy has been explored in Bharatiya Parampara, both in pure tattva and in through the forms of stories, as well as through Prashnottara. So even philosophy has been presented in different ways, so that it is appealing to different kinds of audiences. So even in Mahabharata, very deep philosophical issues have been explored and presented through very fascinating stories. I guess there lies the success of our philosophy going far and wide and seeping into the society. Any questions for Swetha ji?
Swetha, I have lots of questions because I think you are like the universe of knowledge, and there cannot be a beginning or end, I think, for what you are and what you contain. It's always fascinating to just, trail your thoughts. So I know I can spend at least the next 10 years trying to get all this from you. So much learning, so much learning. I think I will connect with you personally, because this is not that I have been tuning into the time for everyone, but it was a lot to take. But I'm not saying informatically, but I was trying to decipher every part of what you were saying, because it has to get into 3-4 layers of consciousness to understand what you were saying, right from morals to everything. And unfortunately, that we don't have today. But thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating, wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Geeta. Thank you so much.
Yes.
And thank you so much.